Just to let you know a little bit about myself, I was with Queensland State Government until 2010. My group was the group that mapped deforestation in Queensland. So each year we go bush and wear out a four-wheel drive. By the way, never buy a second-hand government four-wheel drive. I know what they do to them. And we used to pore over these satellite images. It was quite a big operation. And we mapped in detail all the deforestation across Queensland. It's pretty scary. We did it back to when the Landsat satellite first started, and over that 20-something years, the average deforestation in Queensland was 400,000 hectares a year. Put that in perspective, that's over 1,000 hectares a day, or 10 square kilometres a day. 10 square kilometres a day being cleared. 93% of that was for beef production. Most of it, 60%, was old growth, virgin forest. So the scale of that is incomprehensible to most city dwellers, but it's just staggering. So anyway, that's what turned me away from what I was doing, even though we were doing great things in getting legislation in. I got fed up with it because we were part funded by the Meat and Livestock Association. So I left them and started doing some work to make it crust, but also started with the volunteering with the World Preservation Foundation and with Beyond Zero Emissions. I co-authored their land use plan and did some work with WPF. Now WPF are really interesting. They're a tiny underfunded organisation, but they're working with a group that's doing a documentary on plant food and planetary boundaries. A serious documentary involving some big names, and I'm the fact checker because of my science background. So we pulled together all of this information on planetary boundaries, and we looked at the effects of a change of diet on these, and the results were staggering. So much so that I wrapped it up, a small part of it up, into this presentation. So you're about to see what the results of this much work over the last few years for the documentary, and we'll give you this much, but all of it is peer-reviewed science or grey literature, government reports or United Nations reports. So this is not hearsay, this is not personal private opinion, this is peer-reviewed science that I'm talking to you about. It's non-controversial. In fact, it's rather breathtaking in its scope. But first of all, I'll show you what I was doing. Monitoring this. Australia invented this means of tree clearing. Two of the biggest dozers you can find, and a massive chain in between them. Each link of the chain is 1/2 metre long. One person cannot pick up one link. They're so big. And these chains just rip through the countryside. Doesn't matter what these trees are, how long they've been standing, doesn't matter what wildlife is in that tree, they just flatten to the ground. The noise is incredible, especially if you've got glass or corellas or cockatoos around. The screeching is amazing. The sound of these dozers going flat out, the roar of the diesel engines, and the thump and screech and crack and pop and smash as the trees fall to the ground. It's rather epic in its proportions. Anyway, Australia developed this method of tree clearing, and now it's spread to Brazil. In southern Brazil, which is now a hotspot of deforestation, where they grow most of the world's soybeans now, called the Cerrado. This method is now being used to clear trees in southern Brazil. So we did it. Yeah, we started it, and now it's spreading. Okay, so it's what we do, isn't it, as a species? It's what we do. We decide to, well, back in the day it used to be called develop the land. Back in the day it used to be called doing the right thing for the country. To clear the trees was equivalent to generating income, making farmland, feeding the community. This was seen as a really good thing to do. So what I'll talk to you about is planetary boundaries. What are the things that makes life on Earth habitable? What supports life on Earth? And are those systems that support life on Earth, how are we going? Have we reached their boundaries? Have we overstepped any? How are we going? There's been a lot of research on this for around the last 15 years, spearheaded by the Copenhagen Resilience Centre. They assembled a team of scientists from around the world, hundreds of scientists, and they've been publishing now and updating that. And they found that there's 9 systems that support life on Earth, and looked at the boundaries. Another group is WWF. They report each year in a Living Planet report, and they give what they call Overshoot Day. This is the day when the demands that humans make on the planet's resources overshoot the capacity of the Earth to produce those resources. And Overshoot Day today was August the 4th. That means since then we've been living on borrowed money effectively. It's like having a credit card and you're spending more on it than you're paying back. Eventually it catches up with you. So Earth is due for an environmental collapse if we don't address this. The planetary boundaries that we have most overstepped are the ones seen in red there. So 3 of the 9 planetary boundaries we've overstepped. We've gone where no man has gone before. We're in a situation where we don't know what the results of that will be. And the scientists who worked out these planetary boundaries were told, okay, we put it into the red if we endanger all life on Earth. So in other words, in these 3 areas, we've already overstepped. We are now endangering all life on Earth. And what are they? Okay, the first one up the top there is biosphere integrity. What that means is biodiversity. You hear a little bit about extinctions and how everyone gets up in arms because some little finch is going extinct. Well, the real problem in biodiversity loss is not the individual species, it's the communities. Sure, we might have some black rhinos still alive on Earth, but the communities are gone. The wild communities that once thrived are now gone. And why is that? We'll get to that. The other boundaries that we've overstepped are the biogeochemical flows. Now, you've probably never heard about it, but the biggest overstep of all on planet Earth is nitrogen pollution. And I'll tell you the nitrogen story shortly. But we are knocking our planet way beyond where it's ever gone before. The other one is phosphorus, and we'll get to that. The other boundaries that we're about to cross are climate change, land system change, in other words deforestation, and ocean acidification. And 3 of them rather, we're not sure. We don't know enough about it to say whether we're in danger or not. So the end result of this talk today is that it's not a question of if the planet will change what it eats. It's a question of when. Because nothing impacts this planet more than what we eat. And the reason for that, not a personal preference, right? It's inevitable. And the reason for that is this. This is how we use the parts of our blue ball in space that we can use. In other words, forget the oceans, forget the ice caps and so on. This is how we use the land that is available to us. The biggest chunk of it is pasture. A third of it, thank God, is still forest. Some is sparse or bare, or we made it into desert, we can't use it, and there's a chunk of cultivated land. So what we see is their settlement infrastructure, which also includes mining and roads and rail and all the rest of it. That takes a tiny slither of planet Earth. If we're going to do something about how we live on this planet, this is the one that we have available to us to work with. So you might get alarmed when you see the new suburbs going up when you trip down to the Gold Coast, but that's tiny, that's infinitesimal compared to what's going on and the deforestation and trashing the planet that's going on beyond the roads. Okay, so of the bits that we control, forget the forests for a minute, pasture is nearly 3/4 of that area. So here is a major threat to civilization, but also here is a major opportunity. If we get it right, we have control over 3/4 of the land area of this planet. Now, tweaking that area is going to make a massive difference, which I'll show you. Okay, some research that came out late last year, group in the United States, they looked at footprint, we were talking about that before, and diet. And they said, okay, we have a business as usual footprint, this is the meat heavy Western diet, down to the vegan diet. So they said, okay, how much land is needed for each of these diets? So they looked at what's known as the healthy diet, and that is low in saturated fat and no sugar, okay? How much difference does that make on our footprint? Very little. Then they looked at percentages of meat that people eat, from 100 down to 20, and the footprint of that. And this is each of those. If we're vegetarian, what's the footprint here? And the least footprint of all is the vegan diet. Now, after today, I think it's a compelling argument that we cannot remain here. We must be as close to this end of the chart as possible to survive. It's not just a matter of having a nice life, it's surviving. Okay? It's impossible to survive unless we do this change. Okay, so deforestation. I said before, forests occupy 30% of the land, but we destroy an area the size of Greece of forest, mainly tropical forest, every year. Here's a chart showing the number of livestock on the planet and the species extinctions on the planet. Okay, destroying forests is destroying ecosystems, so that's the major problem. So they're tracking hand in hand. The amount of livestock on planet Earth is just staggering right now. For example, in Australia, each of us consume, normal Australian diet, right, consumes 25 animals per year. It's a cow and a bit, it's a pig and a half, it's 21 chooks, and a few other things. So you can think about it. In your suburb where you live, the family next door, it's a family of 4. They've got 100 animals on the average Australian diet. Now those animals aren't in their backyard. If they were, they'd create a hell of a mess. But they're out there, beyond our vision, trashing the planet, effectively. So, here's what the science says. Land clearing planetary boundary will be exceeded by 25 2025 to 2035. It's within 10 years or so. Biocapacity and ecological footprint boundary will be hit by 2050. This is a separate report. And the result, if we hit that boundary, is ecological collapse. Ecological collapse. We're not talking about, quality of life. We're talking about survival. We now know, there's science there, that 84% of deforestation is for agriculture, and 80% of Amazon deforestation is for livestock grazing or soybean livestock feed. There's a really interesting story here. China, about 20 years ago, 25, they had major problems with rainfall, landslip and landslides. The problems they found out was due to the forests having been cut down. So, central government, wish we could do it, decided, let's reforest, and they did. They reforested China, and China is the country which is reforesting more than any other country. They've got this great green wall, which is being used to hold back the Gobi Desert, which was advancing steadily. They've done an amazing job of reforesting China. However, China is the world's biggest importer of Brazilian and South American soybeans. So they've effectively transferred their problem offshore. It's a global market now. We cannot think in isolation. Okay, just a point of clarification. Up until recently, the science literature was saying, what is the causes of deforestation? And they talk about logging. They talk about, the worst one is clearfell logging. Then they talk about infrastructure. They talk about roads and patterns to get into the forest. But please, I want to be very clear, logging does not kill forests. Even clearfell logging and flame bombing like they do in Victoria does not kill forests. Even if they did that, clearfell, and left it alone, it would become forest once again. To kill a forest, what you do is you burn, baby, burn. Repeated burning, and often associated with ploughing, is the way to kill a forest. So, logging does not kill forests. What kills the forests is the land use after the forest is gone. No one's going to go in there and burn just for the hell of it. They burn because they want to use the land. So now we know that land, if it's used for soybean production, then that is what caused the deforestation. Be very clear. NASA put out 10 daily charts, maps of the forest, of the fire around the world. And it's breathtaking. Africa is the world's fire nation, followed by South America, but we don't miss out. We have our own claim to fame, because in the northern parts of Australia, an area twice the size of Victoria is put to the torch every year. You probably didn't know that. But the reason is that if by burning off the old dead grass, which grows like crazy through the wet season, then dries off in the dry season, by burning that, they create green pick. The cattle don't like old dead grass. They like the high protein green nutrients. So they kill off the dead grass, and fire stops what they call woody weeds, in other words, reforestation from happening. So NASA said that we have 100 years for the rainforest left. That's actually old research now, it's less than that. World Watch Institute are saying that switching from animal protein to plant protein can stop deforestation. Simple as that. Okay, biodiversity loss. This is the one that we've most overstepped. We're now in the middle of what scientists refer to as the 6th great extinction on planet Earth. Okay, there have been 5 extinctions before us. One of them took out the dinosaurs. These extinctions have, at the worst, wiped out 95% of life on Earth. Does that make sense to you? In Australia, it's even worse than that. 1/2 of the countryside is devoted to livestock grazing of Australia. The rest is desert and not very habitable. 1/2 is devoted to livestock. 11% is devoted to agriculture and cropping. Of that cropping, the crops that are grown for and consumed in Australia, that is domestically consumed, this is part of the research we did for the Beyond Zero Emissions land use plan, 2/3 of that nationally consumed crops are fed to livestock, not to humans. Okay, so if we decided we'd have no livestock tomorrow, we'd have 2/3, an extra 200% on top of the human consumed crops to plant for food for humans, not food for livestock. So mink is the biggest threat for wildlife. It's not feral cats, it's mink. It's pretty simple. The Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency in 2010 published on this, and they said, what's the most effective thing to stop biodiversity loss? And they found that the most effective thing was a no-meat diet. They modelled a lot of things, including, okay, let's take all the national parks and reserves in the world and double the size. What effect is that going to have? And it had 40%. It's nowhere near as effective as this. Okay, land degradation, I'll skip through this. It's pretty sobering. 69% of the land is degraded, 25% highly degraded. 50% of the world's agricultural soils are gone. The way we industrially do our farming these days is turning soil into dirt. When we turn it into dirt, it just doesn't support plants anymore, so it's abandoned. So we have 60 years of farming left if the soil degradation continues. So here's a really strong argument for the trend to organic, or the new term is agroecological farming. You use chemicals when you have to, but you avoid them if at all possible, and you use natural processes to do the work. And the loss of that soil carbon is huge. So soil is being lost into the oceans. In Australia, we're losing soil 5 times faster than we're creating soil. In China, it's 57 times faster because they are heavy users. Overgrazing is the greatest cause of soil degradation, and we're losing 2 million hectares a year from soil erosion, just lost. Nothing grows on it. Such that 430 million hectares of cropland are now abandoned. Okay, water, pretty essential for life, don't you think? By 2030, we're going to need 40% more water than what we have available now. Over half of the world's aquifers are threatened. This is all science, this is all very steady stuff. There's nothing controversial here, except it has not come to the public attention yet. You don't see this in the press. You don't see many news articles about this stuff, but it's happening. The biggest problem, water-wise, is that the sub-Saharan Africa is becoming drought affected, more and more drought affected. The Sahara is moving south, and all those countries that are bordering the Sahara are getting hotter and drier and less water. They have to go further down for water. That's impacted them in a big way. We've already seen some refugees, but by 2020, 3 years away, they expect 60 million sub-Saharan climate refugees. If you haven't got water, you haven't got crops, you haven't got food to feed the family, what do? You've got to walk Meat and dairy are heavy water users. As you see here, a hamburger takes 2,400 litres, a potato, 25. Okay, the Stockholm International Water Institute put out a report in 2012 that looked at the state of the world's water and how we're going. And their conclusions were quite eye-opening. They said that if animal food consumption is reduced to 5% of total calories, that is a 75% reduction of animal food, then we will have enough water to feed the world. If not, we won't. That's a very sobering fact. Nitrogen pollution. This is really bad. This is a really interesting story, by the way. I don't know if you were young, you might have been told as a little boy or whatever, go and pee on the lemon tree. Plants love it. Urine from animals, including humans, has a lot of nitrogen in it. So if we recycle that nitrogen directly onto plants, they love it, they soak it up. Nitrogen is fixed. Okay, the first test for protein content of any food, the first level test that they do is nitrogen content. So in other words, nitrogen equals protein. So, dark green leaves on plants means that they're full of protein, full of nitrogen. Animals know that, that's why they eat them. Unless the plant has a protective mechanism to make the animal sick, that's what they will eat. So, the whole world's natural production of fixing nitrogen in plant leaves, the natural process of fixing nitrogen, which becomes available to animals like us to eat, has now been equalled by this chemical process called the Haber-Bosch process. It's the process by which we make nitrogenous fertiliser, nitrogen fertiliser, so that sort of thing. So we humans have equalled nature. Nature produces this much nitrogen, protein. We produce this much nitrogen, protein. We've equalled nature. And because of that, we pour it on our crops go nuts because they love protein. They love the nitrogen. And that's how we get away with using substandard soils to produce plants for the food that we eat. Most of the food that we eat grows big and lush, but what's the real nutrient content of that? It's big because it's got lots of nitrogen, but is it lacking in all these other things? It is. Animals, like us, are concentrators of nitrogen. Most of what we eat, the nitrogen that we eat, we lose. So most of the protein that we eat, we lose through our urine. With animals, it's the same thing. So of all the crops and all the feed crops and all the green stuff that's fed to animals, eventually, most of it ends up here. If, for example, we eat beef, the protein that fed the animal that fed us, of that protein, 4% remains in us. The other 96% is lost as reactive nitrogen. It's not lost at all. It becomes pollution. It pollutes the environment as reactive nitrogen. And you end up with these concentrated nitrogen pollution sources. So much so that, I don't think I have the reference to it here, but they've now, the Mississippi River is the worst of all this because it drains so many states with lots of agriculture, and it drains out into the Gulf of Mexico. There's now many dead zones, permanent dead zones in that ocean because of the amount of nitrogen. The nitrogen's pumped out, okay, it makes the algae go nuts for a bit. They die, they settle to the bottom, they soak up all the oxygen. So it deoxygenates water, and when there's no oxygen in water, there's no life in water. So, that's the nitrogen story. It's and this is the planetary boundary that we've most overstepped. You don't hear about this stuff, but it's pretty remarkable. So animal waste, nitrogen, acidifies and eutrophies fresh water, decreases biodiversity, degrades coastal water polluter. There's a lot of literature on this now. Okay, this all runs out in the oceans, but what else is happening in the oceans is that overfishing has wiped out 90% of the big fish, the fish we eat. Bottom trawling has ploughed the continental shelves, like this, you see in the top slide there. We've graded it all. We've killed the ecosystems there. And here's a shot of, in the China Sea, of competing for fishes. This is really scary stuff. Have a look at this. This is amazing. This area off North America in the Atlantic used to be called the Cod Banks, still is. It was called that because it was just overrun with cod. The abundance there was amazing. Have a look at the density of fish on the cod banks now, then, back in 1900, and now. Okay, if you're a POM, if you're English and you bought fish and chips until not so long ago, it was cod. Now you cannot buy cod in England and the UK. It's illegal because they're trying to get the populations back again. Okay, climate. This is where we're almost overstepped. The evidence is, it's overwhelming now, to the point where half of the major extreme weather, 2011, 2015, was climate boosted. And there are 41 cases of regional tipping points where we have abrupt, irreversible change that have been documented. You might have heard of tipping points before. What are tipping points? This is where we push the ecosystem to a point where, I can't do this anymore. And it gives up and it reverts, it flips back to another state. If people tell you that the climate nonsense is overblown and that we'll never hit these tipping points, well, we have. There's 41 examples. And a lot of them are, for example, the loss of water, where a glacier has just disappeared, or snowmelt that feeds a downstream river 12 months every year has stopped. Okay, here's a great example of that. This is the what do you call it? The boundary between Bangladesh and India. Now, Bangladesh is particularly susceptible to climate change. The rivers are not running like they used to. The wet season runs more, the dry season dries up. And the groundwater disappears. They have to go a long way to find it. There are a lot of people in Bangladesh, and the Indians know that pretty soon they will have millions of climate refugees, millions. And they do this. So all along their shared border, they have this, preventing the Bangladeshis from walking. You're going to walk over another border. Anyway, here's another example. The Syrian refugees. This has been linked, science has linked this now to climate change. In the Indus River, the Fertile Crescent, it's fed civilization for many centuries. It was the original birth of agriculture. It's now when we had what they call the millennial drought, it was the hottest and the driest drought they've ever had there. Now, if you're on your farm with your family and it's dry one year, farmers have amazing hope. They live in hope. The next year it's dry again, the next year it's dry. So eventually you run out of food, there's no food, what do? You move to the city. So, in the cities in Syria, you've had the refugees from the Iraqi wars, you've got Sunni Muslims, you've got Shiite Muslims, and you've got overwhelmed cities. So what do? Conflict breaks out. What do you do for your family if that sort of thing happens? You walk, which is exactly what they do. They walk into Europe. And all the problems caused there. We're not alone. I mean, if we didn't have the strict border controls that we have, we'd be under the gun as well. So what's going to happen in Australia? By 2090, we're going to have between 0.6 and 5.1 degrees of warming across the nation, depending on the scenario and where you are. The rangelands are going to warm between 2.9 to 5.3 degrees. This is shocking. And the east coast warms 2.7 to 4.7. This is where we live. Well, so what? So what does 4.7 degrees mean anyway? It means that Brisbane becomes Townsville. So what? Well, it's not as simple as that. The climate is pretty finely tuned. It's not exactly the heat, it's a combination of all these things. What's happened is that the extra energy in the atmosphere has meant that there's more water vapour, so there's more evaporation, so there's 7% more water vapour in the atmosphere. So now, when it rains, it pours. And when it's dry, it's hotter, more evaporation, drier, and now longer, more severe. So extreme weather events are going to get more extreme. So flood events, if you're living in an area where flood could be a problem, I'd move, quite frankly. If you live beside the ocean, sea level rise isn't going to get you for another few generations, so you don't need to worry too much. But if you're living in an area that could be flooded, that's the danger zone to me. And of course this affects crops, big time. The northern Australia, which is, okay, north of the Queensland border is where 70% of Australia's beef is produced. It's rangelands, it's not much good for crops, and you can't feed many cattle, but there's a lot of land. Now, if you're looking at a few degrees warmer and more extreme at very little prices, and hallelujah, it's all good again. Farmers don't see us last year, they see next year. So they stock up again, and it continues. The hydrogeological cycle. Anyway, this is proof positive of global warming. It's got to be. What else could be? I love that slide. All right. There's a lot of top-down and bottom-up methane studies lately. They've measured what's in the atmosphere and where did it come from. And they found that there's a lot more methane from cattle than they thought there were, both bottom-up and top-down. So we're underreporting cattle big time. There's probably a lot more cattle in the world than we know there are. By cattle I mean ruminants, the animals with the multiple stomachs that use bacteria in the gut to make use of the food. That produces a lot of methane. Now methane's a nasty gas. Over 100 years, methane is at least 28 times more potent than CO2. Over 20 years, methane only lasts about 10 years, but over 20 years, it's over 100 times more potent than CO2. So it's a nasty stuff. Most of the methane comes from ruminants. So these little guys with their big brown eyes, I used to think they were beautiful animals, but now I see them as four-legged methane factories, and they've got to go. Okay, you can see methane in the thermal infrared. This is an example. I couldn't find one of a cow breathing it out, but this is an example of how you see it in a camera like that. Okay, beyond zero emissions, where does the methane come from? This is grazed beef here. This is the sheep. This is from all the dairy farms. This is feedlot beef. Goats, horses, pigs, feral animals, feral goats, and termites. Some people were saying, oh yeah, termites are producing just as much methane as cattle, so we don't need to worry about it. Well, no. Feedlot beef. We found that the greatest number of initiatives to reduce methane in ruminants was done in feedlots. If they put oilseeds into their feed, if they give them certain supplements, that can reduce the methane. But you can't supplement an animal out on the rangelands. It's just not possible. So the fiddling around with feedlot supplements is a waste of time. They'll put it up to you as a wonderful solution, but it's not. The good news is that methane dissipates in 10 years, which is one reason why the global science community has largely ignored it. They have their eye on the long game. Okay, here's a bit of climate science for you, just before you nod off. No, you haven't already. Okay, if you emit carbon dioxide now, after 30 years, half of it is gone from the atmosphere into the land, into the water, mostly into the ocean. After another 1,000 years, 2 blocks away, 20% of your original methane emission is still there. So that sting in the tail is the nasty thing that the climate scientists are really worried about. Methane, on the other hand, in 10 years is gone. So why do we need to worry about it? Climate scientists have had this thinking, but now many are coming around, okay, methane is actually a great opportunity because it's gone so quickly. We know that since industrialisation, methane has caused more than a third of global warming. So it's a powerful lever we have at our control. More than a third of global warming. So what can we do about it? Well, if we stop the methane, here's what we get. A global diet without ruminant products, red meat, can slow warming by up to 25 years. Okay, if we just take the ruminants, the cows and the sheep and the goats, off our diet, the red meat, we can slow global warming by up to 25 years. Wouldn't that be nice? Then we can elect a government who can actually do something about it, given an extra 25 years. You think they'd use that? Anyway. So, in the long term, we need to soak up that CO2, that sting in the tail that's out there. That legacy CO2 it can't be dismissed. We've got to do something about it. And what's the best thing to do with it? The Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency put out a report that showed that it's the lowest cost mitigation is to grow vegetation. Sure, grow a tree, grow grass below ground, above ground carbon. And if we retire grazing lands and feed crops, in other words, we take all the animals off the landscape through a low meat diet or an animal free diet, we save up to 80% of the cost of mitigation. Mitigation means fixing it up after it's hit the fan and we've got the climate change and it's really bad. So we can save 80% of the cost of that just by going vegan. And here's an example of what would happen. 51% of sub-Saharan Africa, if we stopped burning the hell out of it and just left it alone, it would regrow as forest. The reason it doesn't regrow now, it's high rainfall, so it'd grow forest, but we put it to the torch every year, so we burn off the saplings that would have come up. So, that's the nasty stuff out of the way. Let's talk about some of the other common ideas that people might have. Are we overpopulated? Do we have too many people on planet Earth? Well, maybe, but we've got 7-point-something billion people, but we have 60-something billion livestock on planet Earth. A lot more mouths to feed than humans. So the Australian diet, the average Australian diet, we consume 2,000 animals over our life, most of them chooks, and 100,000 eggs. That's staggering. But look what we've done. We've got so much livestock on the planet now, it outweighs wildlife 18 to 1. And the livestock outweigh us by 2 to 1. So effectively we've got 3 times the population of humans that we've got in live weight. So have we got an overpopulation problem? We can immediately reduce that by 2/3 just by getting rid of the livestock. So have we got a population problem? No. We've got a diet problem. Okay, so feedlot intensification boosted production. Yes, they're doing all these things to increase it. But damn it, a doubling production is simply not possible without severe environmental damage. And without livestock to feed, we would have a 50% surplus of food. Isn't that exciting? Okay, the other issue. Just address this in a little time. We put out a report a little while ago. In the UK, most Western governments have a real problem with their budgets. And the problem is that baby boomers like me, the post-war baby boomers, are ageing. And the end of life of any of us is the most expensive bit for our health. So what they're saying now is that Western countries will be bankrupted purely from the health costs of the baby boomers. Well, here's the numbers. Today there's 4,000 Australians, over 100. By mid-century there'll be 70,000. Won't that be expensive to look after? So here's the fix for that. Of course, we've got a solution. Chronic disease is responsible for 60% of deaths. That is lifestyle disease. The diseases that we have control over. People say cancer, oh, horrible, nasty. Isn't it terrible? How on earth would that have happened? Well, we know how. A lot of it. Some of it is inexplicable, but a lot of it is. You're 40% less likely to develop cancer if you're vegetarian. You're 30% lower risk of heart disease if you're vegetarian. And you're 70% reduced risk of diabetes if you're vegan. This is not just, oh, that's a nice number. It's like, this is the difference between bankrupting the country or not. We did a report on Bill Clinton. You might have heard of his story. He had a heart attack. He had a couple of stents put in, and this was just after he retired from his presidency. And he decided, okay, what are we going to do about this? I'm a thoughtful person, so how did this happen and how can I fix it? Well, he went and saw a lot of doctors, and he came across these guys, Esselstyn, Bernard, and he said, okay, what's the solution? And the solution was a plant-based, low refined oil diet. That's it. And this is a direct quote from Esselstyn, who's put out a lot of papers. This is in one. A switch to a diet free of meat and dairy products will dramatically reduce obesity, cancer, heart disease and diabetes. Family history and genetic background do not cause this illness. Genes load the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. There's the answer. And there's a lot of misinformation around this, of course. The world's largest dietetic organisation now sees the vegan and vegetarian diets as perfectly adequate for all of us, no matter what sex, no matter if we're having kids or no matter old or young. They even talk about the health benefits of that. So that's an amazing thing for an organisation like that to turn around. So the future food, this is the bottom line for this, our future diet on planet Earth will have a profound effect on water, food, health, climate, employment, ocean health and pollution. Employment because organic farming is a lot more labour intensive. So, to go from this to a planet that's a plentiful future, A substantial reduction of environmental impacts would only be possible without a substantial worldwide diet change away from animal products. That's a pretty strong statement for the United Nations to make. You know how many bodies lobby these groups. To have a statement like this in a publication of theirs is pretty strong stuff. So, what's my personal footprint? Am I up here? Am I here? Am I down here? I know that if I'm down here, the world will survive. But what about in between? So, if we want to stop biodiversity loss, which is the greatest overstep, we need to be vegan, bottom line. If we want to have enough water by 2050, we need to cut our diet down to 5% animal protein. If we want to halt deforestation, we need to be up the vegetarian end. If we want to halt nitrogen pollution, we've got to be up the vegetarian end. If we kick red meat out of our diet and we want to slow global warming by 25 years, that's where we go. And if we do that, we return pastures to vegetation drawdown. Nature is amazing. It bounces back so quickly. It's incredible. And that's the end.